back to Necropolis AD. We are here with some wonderful guests. We have Brett Stevens returning for a third time, aka Sodomizer from deathmetal.org, America.org, the author of Nihilism on Newman Books. Thank you very much for joining again, Mr. Sodomizer.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Always great chatting with you. I'm glad we have this format now to actually have some meaningful discussions that we can have together. We have Paul from Condemner, the Texas death metal band Condemner, returning today. We had a great discussion on the first episode of Necropolis AD. Thank you for returning, Paul.
Glad to be here.
And we have kind of an eclectic guy here. He's someone that I've chatted with for about 10 years, I would say, just on the internet, and discuss a lot of philosophy with him. A very, very intelligent man. He's a philosopher. He's an artist. He's has musical projects, so he's a musician, and he's also a rapper. But some of you guys out there may know him about his Pariah Conservatism blog, as well as one of his projects, Chupacabra. Thank you, Jacob, for joining. Jacob.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yes, great to finally chat with you. We've exchanged words so many different times, and it's great to actually have you on a podcast so we can kind of have a meeting of the minds with our voices. So anyway, the topic of today was Jacob recommended in an email thread that we had was appearances versus structure. And structure itself is very, very broad. Like, you know, we have our DNA structure, we have galaxies are structured, atomic structures, molecular structures, we have societal structures, we have musical structures, structure. Oh my God. And without structure, I believe we become feral beasts who cannot be tamed. So kind of the first question I wanted, it's a broad question. I'll start with Sodomizer here. Are we taming ourselves with structure? Like, is too much structure a hindrance? Like with Plato's tripartite soul, you know, he wants to harmonize the three aspects of the soul, which one is the appetite, one is the spirit, and then one is the rational part. Is too much of the rational side a hindrance? Could lead to like the bureaucratic state that we currently have. Just a easy little question for you. They had no idea where you take it, Mr. Sodomizer.
Well, that's a softball question because you basically answered it in the asking. If he believes in the harmony between the three parts of the soul, no one part can dominate, or that's going to be out of harmony. That's going to be a disturbance. And I think the point he's making there is that these aspects have to be in parallel. And I write a lot about parallelism and the need for parallel between energy, idea, and matter. And what he's saying, applying that to the soul, is that these things are sort of checks and balances on one another. And keeping them in balance means that no one is going to become a method used in lieu of having actual intention and mental clarity. Because I think Plato understood that like Kant, that the real threat to human consciousness is an inability to formulate goals and to have clear perceptions about reality and about the intuition. So at that point, all chaotic thinking and all irrelevant thinking, all of what Kant calls hypothetical thinking, becomes really dangerous because you can get lost in the woods. You can wander off and be completely distracted by all sorts of little stuff and miss the big point. And Plato's sort of general riff is to look at cause-effect reasoning and get the big point from that. He's the original first principles kind of guy. And so I think what he would say is if you have too much focus on rationality, you're going to lose sight of the other things, including spirit, which is what our other commentator, David Rosales-Darg, was focused on. And when you lose that, you've become sort of a slave to your own methods, as opposed to being the master who is directing towards something useful and purposeful that's based in reality, which is really what you need. So he would definitely, I think, be afraid of people who are too rationalist. because that can work backwards. You end up with an inverted thought process when you rationalize too much, as happened with the sophists and Pharisees in the Bible, where they were so focused on rules and so focused on deductive thinking that they missed out on abductive thinking, which is what is the most likely outcome if we have a history of patterns and of cause-effect relationships. So I would say he definitely is very skeptical of too much rationalization and too much rationalism in the human mind, because it ultimately becomes as much of a form of mental slavery as idol worship.
I see. Yeah, I would definitely echo that sentiment from Plato, and he kind of warned against anything, becoming dominant, like you said. Like, you don't want to be ruled by your genitals, or else, everything will be the island of Dr. Morale, bestial orgies. So Jacob, you know your Plato pretty well, Jacob. Do you have anything you want to add on to what Mr. Stevens said here?
Well, I think I would say that I agree with the general picture that Brett Stevens is painting here. I would add to that if we look at structure as etymology, what do you call it in English? Sorry, I have to warm up here. The origin of the word, it basically means the organization of the multiple parts into a greater thing than just the sum of the parts, a greater whole. So when you look at structure versus appearances, the appearance or the phenomenal world, the thing as you meet it immediately through your senses, perhaps, is only part of the picture, and that goes likewise with the way that we tend to rationalize things. So structure is, when you put it or pit it against appearances, something that implies a greater picture, which we are not necessarily in a position to always grasp in its totality, but we have to be aware that the stuff that we are dealing with, whether it is mental, rational concepts, or whether it is our senses, or whether it is our feelings, that it fits into a greater whole, which ultimately is reality itself. And this goes closely to what I would say is human intelligence. We are able to be open to or adaptive to new information as it presents itself, and not get locked into sort of conceptual prisons or prisons of our own desires, our own emotions, etc.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking earlier that we may, like, just as intelligent creatures, we may innately strive for structure, just as human beings. And like, when we don't have that structure, we become feral animals. Like, you see the children, that are raised in the wilderness away from civilization, and they're essentially animals. Like, they're feral and all that, but there's something about us working in groups that once we have that social component, then we start to try to structure everything. Like, this is innate, like an intuitive drive to have some sort of structure, perhaps starting out in the social groups. And it's my interpretation of why humans have big brains, quote unquote, is because at some point in our social groups, we started using tools. And once we started utilizing tools, our brains got bigger and made even more sophisticated tools. And we started agriculture and all that. And, just things became more complex. And it did, like you were saying, it did all these elements in our quote unquote evolution of getting bigger brains. It does lead to greater things that we achieve. It's just this continual greater and greater aspect. And but I'm kind of drifting a little too far. But I feel that ever since, if we become socialized, rather than being born in the wilderness and raised by wolves and, Jungle Book and all that, we just our social groups itself there's structure there that we desire. Paul, do you have any thoughts about structure?
Well, back to the topic of whether you can have too much of it or not, and regulations taking over. To quote Hume, reason is a slave to the passions. So reason could tell us like how to get to a goal, but at the end of the day, it cannot tell us what our goal should be. And ultimately, like for, organizing ourselves, we can't go on strict logic, strict structure. For our larger organizing purposes, to a larger extent, we have to go off of passions and aesthetics because, again, reason can only tell us how to get to a goal. It can't give us a good goal in and of itself.
I see. Do you view reason as more of a quote unquote tool, like I was saying?
Yes.
Okay, very cool, very cool. It's all circular. Got the sodomy going on today between us, gentlemen. But just the appearances versus the underlying structure. What kind of appearances would you say you would be a good example, Jakob? Because you wanted to really dig into this topic of appearances versus underlying structure. We talked a little bit about the tripartite soul and a little bit about the phenomenal world, which we can go in any direction. We go the Schopenhauerian route and say appearances is just representation. We can say that appearances are just aspects of escapism. What do you mean by appearances in that specific instance, Jakob?
Well, I would like to pause a little bit on the hardcore philosophy. We can always get to that. My main intuitive thought was more along the lines of when you look at something like metal as a sociological phenomenon, and the way that the musical subculture with its own rules and the way that it evolved over time, how it grew to become something like an antithetical expression when you look at pop culture as the opposite example, where pop culture is really totally obsessed with the appearance of things, even to the point that you are being served, if you listen to the radio or you listen to the streaming services with the biggest hits, you are actually being served with almost totally identical structures over and over again, to the point that I think to the vast majority of consumers, the fact that there is a structure to this stuff becomes completely unconscious. I mean, you made a comment on my initial email with regards to something like hypnoticism, that pop culture is more hypnotic than metal is, and I think that there's a point to this, because when you look at the spectrum of pop music, for example, you see enormous aesthetic variance. There's a lot of different voices and textures being employed, but they're all sort of telling you the same thing. But you're not aware of it if you're not if you're immersed in this sort of pop cultural stream. You only pay attention to the different little aspects that makes the songs emotionally appealing in different sorts of ways, and you get like major tropes. There's like the emotional introspective songs, and there's the party songs, and there's the let's get busy songs and stuff like that. Whereas metal works the other way around, I think, by employing sort of like a more grayish, uniform sort of aesthetics with the distorted vocals and the distorted guitars and the tempos from the drums, which rarely fall into the, at least not if we're talking quality metal. It doesn't fall into the, predictable sort of heartbeat like rhythm. You get variance. It's a musical subculture that emphasizes the fact that to become aware of the qualities of this stuff is to become aware that there's a structure going on behind it all, which makes the music exciting on a whole different level than the stuff that is exciting for pop music. And in that sense, I think you could say that metal sort of represents a cultivation of a different sort of awareness that stands in stark contrast to the popular culture. So that was my sort of initial idea.
Yeah, great points. And I love that we got into the metal. But just a quick question, just to follow on, then we'll get to Sodomizer here. I was just thinking, you brought up like there's party songs and all that. There's love songs and pop. What do you think would be like the most quote unquote authentic pop music expression to be? I was thinking, is it breakup songs? Like when, someone's depressed because there's, broke up their girlfriend or boyfriend. So I don't know. I'm just a question of what do you think is there any authenticity? That's an even better question to pop music, or is it all just trivial surface level bullshit?
Well, I think you could say that trivial surface level bullshit has its own sort of authenticity as well. I think, but I think the breakup song is actually a pretty good example of the archetypal pop song, and it's because when you're in the breakup state, you're sort of entrenched in your own immediate emotional misery to the point that you can't really focus on anything else. So what you need in that sort of state is to feel recognized and seen in that state. And that is by receiving this sort of outpouring of immediate emotions that you are not alone, that everybody is going through this. And in that sense, you are not something out of the ordinary. It's a natural state, even though you feel horrible. So that would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, I had a friend one time. This is a long time ago. I had broken up this girlfriend that I was in love with, or she broke up with me. I forgot how it went down. And I was hanging out with one of my friends, and I'm like, man, I'm really fucking bummed out. And he looked over at me and it's like, Jason, this is why people write all the breakup and love songs that, when things go sour, people feel shitty. But Sodomizer, can you sodomize this pop music for us?
I think we could summarize pop music and even folk music to a degree with the idea of validate my appetites, meaning it's, to use the Buddhist term, it's appetitive. It's based on desire. And so we're going to have a couple variations on that, as Jacob mentioned. There's the I want to have sex with this girl. There's the I had sex with this girl and it didn't work. There's the I had sex with this girl, it worked for a while, and now she's gone and I'm sad. And then you have the party song, which is just like, instead of having sex, I just want to eat a whole bunch of food and drink a whole bunch of beer. And that's basically Pantera, But I think that people are looking for a social validation and approval of their pain. And that's sort of an attempt to, I don't know, strengthen the individual in the face of adversity. I mean, if we go back to American pop, the root of it would be acknowledged by most as the blues. Obviously, there's a lot of precursors to that, and the blues itself is a forgery because it's just sort of a commercial middle point between several different genres that just ended up being the best thing you could market, as far as the easiest to produce, the easiest for people to comprehend, that kind of thing. I think it's a product of capitalism more than culture, and I don't mean that in a bad way because I enjoy capitalism, but I think that
praise be to Costco warrior. Fuck yeah, capitalism, Costco.
Well, there's a wonderful sense to greater efficiencies. I mean, why spend all of our time doing stuff when we can just go to Costco and pick up some things? And, at some point it'll all be automated anyway. It makes good sense to me to eliminate to further eliminate some of the tedium of life. That's what agriculture did. Instead of having to forage exclusively, you just grew your food and you had to harvest it, but it's close by your home. You could make it more efficient and so forth and so on. I mean, this is a long-standing process. But yeah, I think there is a product nature to pop, and I don't think we can escape that. I think we can see it as what it is, which is music for people to purchase that's going to make them feel better about life and feel more connected. But ultimately, it's individualistic music. It's connecting you to the self. I mean, what is every blues song about at its core? It's about the singer feeling bad and the audience feeling bad with them, and then feeling it's okay to feel bad. It's like, well, we're all losers. Let's be losers together. No
I like
offense,
the idea of
but
selling your soul for musical ability, and that myth is all throughout the blues. I mean, I'm not a fan. I mean, I would say like I'm a fan of Black Sabbath, which is quite bluesy, but I'm talking about more of the musical side rather than lyrical.
Sure. I'm not really a huge blues fan either. I think that's the sold your soul to Satan thing seems to me to be a further extension of the artist communing with some force beyond themselves. This is like the Aeolian harp was in Romantic literature. It's the idea that the artist is an antenna or a conduit versus a creator on their own.
Yep, excellent point. I think that's a blues sentiment, but metal itself, it kind of took that and, reaching for the beyond and being really inspired by the beyond. Paul, do you have anything to echo that Mr. Stevens was stating about structure and blues, metal, and all of sodomy?
So I agree with Brett much more than I agree with Jacob on this one. In terms of musical structure itself, I don't think that you can say that pop all boils down to one structure. You maybe could say that 30 years ago, but like if you listen to pop radio today, you'll hear everything from songs where even the chorus is not a differing theme. Like all they do is layer in two more instruments to make the chorus louder than the verse. And it sits on the same chord progression, same melody, and we're just going to make it louder and we develop nothing. And then on the other spectrum of that, there are pop songs that have legitimate development, even a little bit beyond verse chorus. I think that we have to look to what defines a pop song versus a metal song. You can't do it by a simple, it's a structure thing. It's what the song communicates. And at the end of the day, a pop song is somewhere in between a jingle, just a simple advertising jingle, some little catchy thing that gets stuck in your head all day that makes you, think of buying a new couch when you hear it. It's somewhere in between that and the, party song or the pity song. Those are the axes, I would say. And it's, you can't say it purely based on how the song is built. It's more based on that somewhat ephemeral what the song communicates. I think it's more, going back to passion versus reason, I think it's more the passions that make something a pop song versus a metal song than the raw musical structure itself does.
That's a good point. Yeah, Jacob, like when you're speaking about the underlying structure, did you meant more than just like how the songs are organized, like the verse, chorus, and all that. The structure, the underlying structure, could also be the quote unquote message, correct?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, there is a fair bit of compositional similarities going on across the popular genres, I would still say, but sure, I'll give that to Paul. That there's also a definite handful of more, I guess you could call it, where it's the general feeling of being entrenched in a certain type of society and societal lifestyle that goes along and is carried along with the pop music that gives it its certain sort of character. But I would still argue that sort of message, if you could call it that, can only be communicated if you do not go too far into intricate structures, because part of what makes pop music really effective as pop music is that you are not really required to pay attention or be aware of the music in a way that radically breaks with the way that you are used to digesting and listening to a pop song. I used to say something along the lines that great pop music is really music that becomes more interesting the less that you pay attention to the music itself, and the more that you are immersed in the feelings, sort of the social situation or the particular emotional memories that the song evokes while you're listening to it. While to get back to the opposition to metal, it can be more about stripping away your immediate reaction to the music and immersing yourself in what the artist is actually trying to communicate in a unique way through the piece that you're listening to.
So I don't even really fully agree with that, because I'm going to give you a particular song as a counterexample. I don't know if you're familiar with the song Levitate by Dua Lipa, but it's, in terms of its musical structure, it's built very similarly actually to a lot of Burzum's Philosopher album. So the song is built on one unchanging chord progression, yes, but if you listen closely, there's a lot of actually very clever and interesting, just strictly at a musical level, a lot of very clever and interesting melodic development in that. It remains, however, strictly a pop song because in intent, what is it? It's this very easy danceable thing about, a boy and a girl falling in love and having a good time and blasting off to the stars. It remains a pop song despite at a musical structure level not being very far off from Burzum's Jesus Todd.
I'm not familiar with the particular song. No.
I think it might make sense here to look at pop instead in terms of where it crossed over. Let's look at the cases that are on the edge of the category. And so I'm going to summon a couple ancient things here. One is Yes, 90125, that album, and the other is Pink Floyd, A Momentary Lapse of Reason. These are pop albums, more comparable sort of to Rush, more than anything else, by progressive rock bands. And what's interesting about them is that you see pop done by masters, musical masters, as opposed to just writing catchy hits masters. I mean, it's not as catchy as George Michael or Madonna, both of whom had excellent songwriters and were talented in their own rights. But it's got that prog heritage where it tries to sort of play with things a little bit. It's informed by classical, it's informed by jazz, by soundtracks, by the long history of pop music, and it aims at sort of a less pure harmony and more of a melodic approach, and it has a little more structure going on. They play a little bit more with that. But I think what makes it pop and what makes all pop is that it's very much focused on a tautology. It's taking someone from a place of uncertainty to a place of certainty without really changing anything. It's just working through the emotions. I think metal is more like romantic classical music and romantic literature in that it's about exploring the world and discovering the intuition as a result and then changing the self. Metal is transformative. It's also Dionysian to a degree. It's about almost, we talk about hypnotic. It's almost about losing yourself in a pattern larger than yourself in order to rediscover the inner parts of yourself so that you can discover what you're actually observing outside. It's much more complex. Really good pop makes you feel really content in the moment. It's tautological. You're starting out with a certain outlook on the world. It's being channeled through someone else's experience. It's being redirected to the self, and it's being explained to you, perhaps rationalized in emotional terms, as something that's in fact good. And I think you guys are onto something when you analyze the emotionality of pop. I think it's surface emotionality. The emotionality is very much on the surface. Metal emotion results from the changes that happen in the song. When you go from one place through this sort of adventure, this poetry, this journey of contrast and conflict that ultimately leads you to a clear view of where you are and what you believe, that the emotion that comes from that is from the change and almost from the gratitude for the change. You're like, wow, I learned something. I grew. I've confronted this. I'm more clear in my thinking. But your emotion also is this sense of connecting to something larger than yourself. I think pop aims to connect you to other people and does so in the form of the self. So it's ultimately about the individual, and that's why it's a superior product. When you listen to pop, it makes you feel better about your life, even if it starts out making you feel worse. That's why people like the blues. Someone's singing about all his troubles, and you're like, wow, actually mowing the lawn isn't so bad now. I'm not really suffering here in contrast. And that's its enduring power. And I think that's why it's always going to be something that people will drift toward. When we look at the pop form, when we talk about the pop song format, we're talking about the 3.5 minute verse chorus turnaround structure. Generally, there's variations on it, and it's kind of cool to see. I think a lot of that's black metal's influence, but generally speaking, that's what people write. And that goes back to folk music from Europe, especially Scotland and Finland, centuries and centuries ago. And that format there is designed, it's designed to bring people together, to bring people into the same state of mind, almost in a ritual sense, but to kind of let them discharge some emotions and come together. And I think this goes back to the origins of music, which is that I think before language, when humans were out hunter-gathering or foraging or hunting or slaughtering or whatever the hell they did, I think they sang to each other before they even had words. They had sounds, and it was probably call and response. You know, you're out there looking for the woolly mammoth, and you see some scat, so you call out a certain sound, and then you hear a certain sound back. You know, we haven't seen the mammoth, or the mammoth's over here, or I feel a mammoth close by, or something. And so I think that exchange of emotions between the individual and the group is the core of pop. It's sort of like bringing people onto the same page. And you can kind of, you know, I think AC/DC, because we love talking about AC/DC on this show, AC/DC captured this when they created songs that essentially take a stadium full of people, move them from chaotic emotions to screaming out Thunderstruck with the same rhythm. It's kind of brilliant in its own way. But I think that, you know, going back to the core of metal versus pop, what I think distinguishes metal as far as structure is the riff. And this was sort of the musical innovation of the, I guess, mid-'60s, was they borrowed from flamenco and really classical guitar, the power chord and related techniques. And that enabled you to have very fluid phrase-based riffs. And those riffs then added an additional layer of complexity in that they needed to talk to each other. It wasn't as simple as having a response defined by harmony that means that the two riffs fit together. The riffs had to actually symbolize something in themselves, and that then had to be answered by something else. So we go to a different kind of call response. Instead of it being vocally based, it's in the phrases themselves, in the melodies and in the rhythm, because rhythm is our primary weapon in metal, including internal rhythm, which is how the speed at which you strum relative to the speed at which you change chords. And that's part of that textural stuff, is a lot of how riffs are differentiated, even if they're totally chromatic. And with the riff, you have a different kind of structure, in that even if you write a verse, chorus, turnaround song, you're still going to have to make those riffs interact, and that's going to force additional changes that are sometimes very subtle, but at the same time, it's not the pop mentality. And in addition, of course, we've gotten away from strictly vocal-based. So we're sort of distancing ourselves from human surface emotions. We're using a harsher sound. It sounds more like death and destruction than it does people singing to each other about love and happiness and wanting to eat pizza or donuts. And I think with this, you also gain this sense that it's almost a message from beyond. So where pop is a message from within, but not really deep within, metal is a message from beyond. It's appealing to the eternal things. And I think that is inherent to the nature of the riff. It's the same reason classical music has such enduring power, in that you've taken music out of the human realm and made it into pure nerve impulse, where the words don't matter as much, the surface emotions don't matter as much. What matters is the change in topography, basically, that's happening under your feet as you're having this adventure, as you're going to places. It's not surprising that metal loves Tolkien and Lovecraft more than anything else. Why? Because metal is adventure music. It is like romantic poetry. It's about heading out into the wild, confronting all sorts of things. You know, you're going to confront Grendel. You're going to confront the dragon, Smaug. You're going to have to slay the dragon. And it puts you in a frame of mind that enables you to leave yourself behind enough that you can be functional to that level. And that's where I think metal's structure is fundamentally different. There's also song structure, and I think that's in part driven by the fact that if you use phrasal riffs, you're going to end up making something like through composed music, because, as the Asphyx guys say, riff gluing, making the riffs talk to each other and work together, is the core of metal. And so I think that's why it will never be like pop in that sense. And when I bring things back to like later Pink Floyd and later Yes, what you're seeing there is bands who have incredible command of music, going back to the pop song format and trying to reinvent it, but not lose that fundamental pop nature. And so what that is the hook, it's the catchy rhythm, and it's something that people can immediately identify with. And that's really an opposite direction to metal, because it aims for finding things that are undiscovered outside of the self, where pop's looking to sort of discover things within the self that bind us all together so we feel better about hunting the mammoth or the donut or whatever. That's all I had to chip in there.
So one thing I would like to add is when talking about distortion in metal as a weapon. So one thing that it does to music very much that is, underspoken about is that there's a concept in a guitar tube amp known as intermodulation distortion. When you play two different tones at the same time, so like a power chord, for instance, into a distorted tube amp or into a distorted solid state amp that tries to emulate this, you end up with harmonics that were not present in the original signal. If you play a power chord, for instance, you end up with a new harmonic that's about an octave below the root note, but you more importantly end up with with a harmonic that is very, very close to the major third. This has all sorts of really weird implications when it comes to how metal, as a result, has to treat the idea of harmony and chord progression, because a pop song, they could, bounce along on a simple resolving chord progression. But when you have a heavily distorted guitar tone, this idea kind of goes away and you can't resolve the same way because, okay, so if you're moving in power chords, now you've only got major thirds available as a chord source. If you try to throw in a minor chord, every time you put in a minor chord, because of that intermodulation distortion and that major third present in the signal between the first and the fifth, if you add a minor third to that, you now have a minor third on major third, half step, meaning you have an inherent dissonance in this chord. So we're out of a realm where we can make music that relies on simply following and completing harmonic expectation. It's no longer even possible on our instrument. That's a element of this that is generally greatly overlooked. And also, if you want to know why some of the black metal bands have the production that they do, little secret that I suspect was done intentionally. There's more going on under the hood in Transylvanian Hunger that most people want to acknowledge, but one of the big ones is the reason it sounds like that, the reason they picked that distortion sound, they intentionally picked a distortion sound that's from some super cheap box that makes no attempt to emulate intermodulation distortion, so that they could actually step back and use some more proper main school harmony theory. And that's why that's done the way it is. It's also why it's so trebly, because another oddity of the distorted electric guitar is that if you play two notes, the lower note is going to be louder than the higher pitched note, which is opposite of what Western music theory wants us to do. Transylvanian Hunger goes against that. So if you want to know why a lot of black metal is produced the way it is, that's why. But if you're talking a more normal metal production with, a raging Marshall or Mesa tube amp, then a lot of the ideas that, pop music would typically have, they're literally off limits to us. We are intentionally putting ourselves in a place where we can't do those things anymore. We cannot give ourselves just an easy nod along resolution harmonically because it's impossible on our instrument.
Yeah, I was actually going to chime in there. Great points about the Transylvanian Hunger, and I actually got a fuck off and die pedal, and it has that same effect where the highest note is really the only audible note. But if you listen really closely, you can hear the lower notes that I'm playing. Like if I'm playing on three strings, the highest string will be the most audible. But if you listen like really, really closely, you can tell the other strings that I'm playing. But great point about how metal is just different textually speaking, and as such, you have a different compositional approach to chords and scales and all that. Great point. Makes it totally dissimilar to pop music. Great insight there, Paul. Thank you very much. And something I also wanted to bring up is the mathematical sublime from. Granted, I'm not a Kant expert yet. However, I will be getting into the Critique of Pure Reason later this week before I formally study it next month. But with the mathematical sublime, kind of what Brett was saying about how metal it's inspired by the beyond, that's what the mathematical sublime is. It's the vastness of something that you really can't take in totality like you can with pop music. It's the motions is very, pop music, you can encapsulate it, stick it, in a product, sell it, and you have everything that is character speaking. But metal, there's almost a Kantian sublime, where something's so vast that you can't take it in totality. Yes, we nowadays we're very familiarized with metal, and we listen to all these classic releases so much. But what drew us into extreme metal, especially, is that Kantian sublime nature. That something is just hard to fucking pin down, to exactly see all the components that comprise it. I mean, it's not impossible, but the analogy that Dr. Benjamin Korsvet made in his book on Bruckner's Eighth Symphony, he talks about the adagio of the Eighth, about how long it is and all the components that you really can't just summarize the Eighth. It just doesn't appear in your mind in totality. You have to listen to the whole thing. And metal, I think, is the same way in a lot of aspects of metal. Granted, we have some rather simplistic bands, but what they're going for, I think, is more like adding an element of atmosphere, like Beherit. Beherit's the easiest stuff to play on guitar, but it's that fucking sinister atmosphere that Marco Lejo or Nuclear Holocaust of Vengeance is able to conjure up. And it's that atmosphere that adds that extra element to it, that gives it the mystique, it gives it the majestic nature, it gives the element of the beyond the shitty societal mundane aspects of our lives that we go through, but it's not the same like it is in classical music, like with Bruckner's Eighth, the adagio, but it does have a kind of like the sheer vastness of something that metal tries to wrangle in its own unique way, and oftentimes a very poetic way. Jacob, I know you're more into the Kant than I am. Hopefully I'll reach up to you someday, but do you have any thoughts on the mathematical sublime in regard to metal?
I think it can serve as an interesting metaphor in the realm of metal. But if we look at the art form itself and the time in which it emerged, I think it's more useful to look at it through the lens of something beyond the scope of human consciousness, appearing out of sort of like the darkness of the collective unconscious, something like a hidden truth, or something that has been neglected, drawing on people like Carl Jung, for example, as opposed to the idea of the mathematical sublime and Kant and all that. Strikes me as more of a it's sort of the same thing, but it's more in the context of Enlightenment philosophy, having a sort of belief in the power of the human mind, insofar as grasping the structure of our knowledge and advancing towards a greater understanding of the exact limits of what we are able to do and not able to do via our concepts and our conceptual thinking in metal. And this goes sort of, I think it reaches into some of the points that Paul had with regards to the aesthetics of the distortion and the way that the notes emerge within the sort of this sort of omnious, strange to sort of grasp harmonic continuity of the riffs and the It's almost as if we have a great Satan, a great undivine and unsublime, something that reaches up from the netherworlds, so to speak, and is steadily engulfing us as a species or something like that, and it is almost metaphysical in a sense. Hence the preoccupation with with Satan and the whole mythological aspect, where metal is sort of obsessed with inverting the Christian symbology. It's not just reveling in the sort of Satanism of the late 60s with LaVey and stuff like that. No, it's almost like taking a literal approach to the Christian mythology of Satan, but saying that this is the real God that is reaching not down from the skies in the form of something sublime, and we are on our right path to realizing this eventually, which I think is sort of like the Enlightenment undercurrent with Kant. That is something that is sort of inverted when you come to Schopenhauer and his interpretation of Kant, where the will steps in as opposed to the thing in itself as something like sort of an unknowable thing. But I get the thing with Kant that the thing in itself is more in harmony with a classical theological approach, an idea of a good and loving God and a humankind that is able to reach sort of a higher state of perfection throughout the correct utilizing of our rationality and our thinking. But to get back with that, I mean, you get sort of like this sense when you listen to a lot of metal of something that is emerging out of the unknown, but it's more like some sort of Lovecraftian malevolent deity or something like that.
Well, a Lovecraftian deity like Cthulhu has, is so massive and beyond our comprehension that it does kind of have a Kantian sublimity there.
Yeah,
You can't take it in totality like you can with pop music. You'll go mad trying to understand the Cthulhu. Sodomizer, some great things that we've been discussing here. Would you agree, like, there's an element of, not necessarily through the Kantian lens that I presented, but especially, like, I have yet to write an article about Schopenhauer and extreme metal, but do you see some correlations to Schopenhauer's aesthetics and extreme metal? Granted, like, I know in the past you've said that vocals are more percussive. It's like a percussive element in extreme metal. Not necessarily about singing and putting yourself in the singer's shoes like in pop music. It's more of this percussive element, and the vocalizations themselves are really harsh and unintelligible. Therefore, you could say in a Schopenhauerian sense that it would meet the criteria for his view of absolute music being the greatest form of art, where you through aesthetics, you're, like we've discussed before, that your mind becomes totally absorbed by the music and it becomes its own kind of ding and sitch.
Sure. Well, I mean, he basically said that music translates into nerve impulses. And so you're getting a direct experience that you're not parsing by putting into words or tokens or numbers. And I think that's the great utility of music in escaping the tyranny of the rational mind. You're able to connect to things that you can't articulate and you don't need to articulate, but you feel or sense. I like sense better than feeling because, of course, in the West, we use the term feel to mean emotions and judgments and moralization. But, my main contribution here, we're talking about Lovecraftian gods and metal and how it seems to like the dark gods and all of that. And, as the Greek black metal guys said, Lucifer and Satan are essentially containers for all of the pagan gods. And the Abrahamists essentially put all of those gods into this form of Satan, the unknowable, it's not safe, the immoral god, the amoral god, whatever it would be. And so I think that pop assumes the existence of a god. Metal assumes that there's no such thing necessarily so. It might be, but it will have to be discovered. So it's more of an esoteric view. But even more, the metal gods are nature gods. They are not moral gods, or, as I would say, being a cynic, social gods in the sense of the various Semitic deities and even some of the Buddhist stuff. These are gods that don't care about your survival. They don't care about morals. They just, like evolution, keep pushing toward higher levels of sort of complexity and resilience and that kind of thing. I mean, you unleash a Cthulhu on a population, it's either going to find a way to defeat him or it's going to be consumed. Well, that's sort of the essence of natural selection there, eat or be eaten. And I think metal embraces that as opposed to rejecting it, where pop finds it horrifying. Pop is more music about moralizing about how terrible it is that you got the blues, that your life is terrible, the girl left you and your car broke down or your truck drove away or whatever the hell it would be. But, I think that when we look at Lovecraftian gods or even a lot of the forces in Tolkien, these are no longer moral gods. These are like the Greco-Roman or Nordic gods. They're nature gods. When you have Poseidon, the god of the sea, he does all sorts of things. He kills you. Your boat gets swamped, you end up dead. Floods occur. Oceans destroy things. Oceans also create and give. And I think that embraces, this is sort of more of an occult view, but it embraces what I won't say is the duality of nature, but really it's amorality. It's completely disconnected from human concerns. It's doing things for its own purposes. And if you want to talk about a sublime, I think you find that in this different attitude toward how the universe works and sort of the source of things. Kant talks about the thing itself, says, well, will we ever connect to it? The answer is probably not. We can only perceive it with senses 5 and derive its structure, sort of in the way that Plato said. We're constantly trying to diagnose something that we'll never directly experience. And with metal, you're almost you're using that distance as a way to remove yourself from your immediate reactions to it. And instead, you're getting to that diagnostic phase where you're able to sort of look into it in terms, as Plato would say, of its consistency. There's cause-effect relationships, and therefore there's some things you can know without experiencing, without feeling, without other people knowing them, without them being socially shared like morality. And that you have to find these on your own through something like an esoteric process. I mean, metal is ultimately adventurer music. If pop music is the music of farmers and brewers and cooks and stuff like that, metal is the music of the lone hunter. It's the dude who heads out into the woods, and let's face it, metal is mostly dudes, and, stalks the beast, hunts the beast, breaks his leg, has to splint it, has to come back, has to overcome hostile tribes. I mean, all of these things metal recognizes. And so its view of God, of gods, is as nature gods. These are not things that can be controlled by human emotions. They're simply things we have to overcome. And that would be blasphemous in the Judeo-Christian heritage and the Islamic one as well. But in metal, there really isn't such a concept as blasphemy. We sort of find blasphemy as funny because there's no way you can blaspheme nature. It simply works. It simply is what it is. And in many ways, metal functions in that sense as a what they call a leader out, someone who leads the group away from something that's got them confused, like leading them out of the Platonic cave. Metal is humanity trying to escape from itself and trying to escape from more than ideals, what I would call is just a symbolic, emotional, and social reality. We talk a lot about demotism and the influence of mass perceptions and preferences in shaping our reality, but even more categories and symbols shape them. As soon as you start dividing the world into good and evil, you've created a world in your head that may not necessarily mirror what's out there. Metal is about escaping that REM called it the moral kiosk, but I would say the mental ghetto, and getting back to the core of perceiving reality itself and perceiving it as an adventure. Pop music is about moving yourself away from risk. Metal is about getting closer to risk, getting closer to that confrontation of life, all the things we fear, so that they can be mastered. It's like a famous sage in a movie once said, "A repo man is always intense." Well, a metalhead is always intense. Our music is about meeting life head on, trying to figure out how it works, and not expecting that how it works is going to map directly to the symbols and the emotions and the sensations that we have as individuals and that we find very powerful because we can share them with the group. And so I think that there's a difference there in fundamental attitude. And I guess when we take it back to the question of gods or God, I said pop assumes the existence of God. It assumes an objective, orderly human world where everything is as it feels and is seen. Metal, echoing some of the comments that have been made here by others, metal assumes that the world is an unknown, that there's not necessarily this good ending that's guaranteed, that there's not necessarily a place of safety, but that we have to leave what we think is the place of safety, connect with life itself, get outside of ourselves, and by doing so, we're going to find the intuition that, as Kant says, is shaped by the universe. It is derived directly from the cosmos in a Platonic sense. And when we connect to that, we're going to be able to have the process, and I know I talked too much about this, I'm sorry, of transcendence, where we suddenly see life. Your Burzum, life has new meaning. That lyric is a classic expression of this, where you suddenly see that life is how it has to be without the human morality, without concern for humans, but that it ultimately leads to a good thing. And I think this is the key point of metal and our embrace of power and death and distortion, and that the adventure is more important than the safety. And so in many ways, metal, in my view of it, is about the fall from grace. You're leaving behind the safety of this moral kiosk, and you're going into the wilds to hunt and to face everything you fear, but it's going to make you stronger. I don't know if metalheads are Nietzscheans, but what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. I think there's a strong overtone of that in all this music. That's all I had to chip in there.
That's all? You don't have any more? That was great. That was great. I love listening to you talk.
Yeah.
Right? Very, very wonderful. I'll let Jacob or Paul chime in. You guys are welcome to add on to what Mr. Stevens was saying about the beyond, the unknown, and the gods of metal and the gods of pop music.
So I would go even a step beyond saying that it's amoral. I would say that in many cases it's anti-moral and actively celebrates destruction. Like, the what lyric I always cite for this is immolation close to world below. That line, glorious flames rise above, show us pain and cleanse our world. Or another example would be Slayer, South of Heaven, the second verse. That stuff, like, it's not even just, yes, this thing is out there and it's beyond our comprehension and it's like natural selection, neither good nor bad. A lot of this is, it is actively evil. It is actively harmful. And we are celebrating the fact that it is actively evil and actively harmful because, partially because humanity is decadent and this is, and humanity getting theirs in this form can be aesthetically pleasing, but also because, the idea at the end of that classic immolation lyric, cleanse our world, it's like show us pain, cleanse our world. Through the evil, it fixes us and improves us, it reforges us. But I think that it's not even just amoral, it's the celebration of anti-moral. It even goes beyond the amoral, I think, even beyond the Lovecraftian.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mentioned Carl Jung earlier, and one of the quotes from one of his works called "A Message to Job," which always reminded me of metal, was that he argued for the fact that 2,000 years of Christian culture had tried to imprison God as the X standing for transcendence as such into 100% positive idea of love, of good emotions, of forgiveness and stuff like that. And this represented to Jung sort of like a collective one-sidedness that would inevitably end up getting the better of us as human beings, because we are not able to fully contain God or reality or transcendence, whatever you want to call it, the greater mystical insight into the greater structure of reality, the universe as such, within this sort of narrow box where we can categorize it as being good, as being love, and whatever. And that is pretty much what the Christian religion had as a philosophical consequence with the evolution over many thousands of years. So he said in the answer to Job that one of the challenges facing humanity would be to come to reckon with the fact that maybe what we've called evil must be bear a certain sort of metaphysical reality in itself, in the form of all the things that we've repressed. I mean, Brett mentioned the way that Satan became a container for the pagan gods, and the pagan gods, in terms, represent the sort of movements within our collective souls, especially in the Western cultures, which is closely affiliated with metal as well. That we can no longer grasp why it is that these sort of impulses, these collective states of oneness with nature, which doesn't fit within the Christian moral container, is necessary for us to thrive and to feel an ultimate connection with the world that we inhabit. And this brings me ultimately to I think one of the greatest symbolical statements in metal as a whole, the title of the third Burzum album, Hvis lyset tager os, or translated to If the Light Takes Us. The fact that to Burzum and Wegwegenes, the darkness became what was worth striving for, and the light was what was to be feared. The light, in this sense, representing everything that the Christian West has come to grasp as being good, as being something to strive for. And I think it's brilliant, this statement in its simplicity, because it doesn't say something like, the church is calling itself the light, but it is actually the real darkness, and we represent the true light. No, it's almost as if we recognize that the whole notion of light, the whole notion of goodness as representing transcendence, has become exhausted. We can no longer say that what we really strive for or want to achieve is to be called good, is to be called the light and stuff like that, because the last couple of thousand years has robbed these terms of any sort of true authentic meaning.
You brought up Burzum, and you're getting into the nitty gritty of that. And it made me think about like the pagan aspects of metal, which Mr. Stevens was already kind of talking about with the worship of nature and all that. But even like pagan gods, like you brought up Poseidon and all that. I always kind of viewed like these gods represent natural phenomena, like they're archetypes for us to kind of rationalize and understand nature on a more higher level, I should say. Like I don't believe like there's actually a monkey god removing curses, in the Hindu canon. But it can be comforting to think that perhaps you have some wickedness cast on you, and it's time to remove that, and how you approach that and bettering yourself. It could be a curse self-inflicted, quote unquote curse, not an actual curse. But for the pagan aspect of the worship of nature, certainly plays a huge role in fucking metal, that Brett was saying earlier. And it's really hard to follow on after Mr. Brett has spoken, because he tends to cover all the facets of what is being discussed. But I also thought, just to bring up the pagan aspect, like there's also a ritual, usually factored into different pagan beliefs, like it's a ritual to affirm aspects of nature and all that. Do you have anything to add on that, Paul, Sodomized, or Jacob?
For sure. I think Jacob was riffing on something interesting when he talked about the light taking us, and how what was once the light now is not the light. And the thing is, I always riff on about means over ends versus ends over means. And I think when good is an affirmative end, when you are striving toward good, you are going to use any means necessary to achieve that. But when things are quiet, you start to reject certain methods, like killing, because you want to keep order, you want to keep unity, you want everyone to feel safe and good. And I think that what metal is saying a lot of the time is that what we think of as the light is really this narrow little world of symbols where we've taken out all the stuff we're afraid of. And as a result, it is not realistic. And because it's not realistic, it is not good. This is a Might is Right riff, but behind Might is Right, there is sort of the idea that realism is more important than moralism. And moralism tends to be means over ends, where you say, thou shalt not kill. Well, that's never made sense to me because some people need killing. If someone is assaulting an innocent victim and won't stop, I'm going to kill his ass, and I'm not going to feel bad about it. You know, in the same way, I don't really feel bad about running the homeless out of town, or rapists, or pedophiles, or any of the other parasites, you know, white-collar criminals too. I mean, any of the parasites out there, they're a threat to good things. And so for you to be good, you have to be bad. And this was Plato's point when he was talking about the nature of things versus their actions. You know, the Ring of the Lydian Gyges, I don't know if I pronounced that right. A good man will hide his good deeds and therefore will look bad. A bad man will hide his bad deeds and therefore look good. Well, if you needed a handy explainer for the type of leaders that democracy chooses or the type of people who are our celebrities and business leaders, that's it right there. The people who are the most deceptive are able to fool the crowd. And this is the inversion that occurs whenever there's a human social event, that signals and symbols and appearances are misleading. And so you have to get to our topic today, structure. What is the actual cause-effect relationship? And so you can't do that in terms of methods alone. You can't say killing is bad because sometimes killing is good and some people need killing. And the structure of things is the question of, well, what is the function of this person in the human ecosystem, in the larger ecosystem of our surrounding nature, and in any I guess you'd call them metaphysical beliefs too. You know, is this person actually contributing something to the order of the universe that we could say is beautiful, good, true, pleasurable, intelligent, wise, any of that stuff? And if they're not, you have a different destiny for them than you would if they were. And I think that when we say the light has taken us, it's more the social light. It is this idea that we can eliminate certain methods that are bad, and therefore everything left is good. But when you think about it, that's a replacement for having a goal. And I think this was Jesus's point, for having an affirmative motivation in the self to try to be good, in a sense, not of avoiding bad, but achieving good. And it's a very fine distinction, but a very, very important one, I think. You know, the Hindus get a ration of shit from everyone, but I think oftentimes we're misreading the religion, because the fundamental idea of Hinduism is duty paired to privilege, and the idea that in everything you do, you have a duty to strive toward what is good. And like in that final battle they write about in the Bhagavad Gita, you know, there's going to be a lot of people dying. It's going to be sad. But if the end result is good, that's better than being afraid to act and being afraid to kill people when you need to, which is essentially the topic of that chapter, when to kill people and how you're going to slaughter many. You know, it's better to achieve a good result than it is to try to achieve good methods. And
well, even in the Old Testament, I like the Old Testament way more than the New Testament, because a lot of people get fucking punished, and you know, God comes down and he floods the world and kills off, you know, everyone other than a few, like Noah and all that. I like how in the Old Testament, at least, I mean, I'm not, you know, a Christian or Abrahamicist or anything like that, but the Old Testament is a lot of fucking vengeance all the time. You know, the Israelites stray from the path and God punishes them over and over and over until they end up under Persian rule. And that's when things get really messy with how Zoroastrianism and Neoplatonism and all that started, you know, getting into favor with them, and you know, thus comes about Christianity. But the Old Testament, there's a lot of instances of, you know, just, you know, it's good for people to die in God's eyes. So and it's kind of like a force of nature too. Like if you don't think God is like a personal like entity or anything like that, just very impersonal. Like the floods we just had, you know, horrible, you know, floods we had here in Texas last week. and unfortunately, a lot of people died. Over 100 people died. But that's just, we try to, we think we can control nature when we build next to rivers. And rivers, if you look at, the geological history of rivers move around. They're not static. They don't stay in one spot. And there's also flooding that happens near rivers. So, yeah, we think we have a handle on nature, but nature snaps. It strikes when we least expect it. And unfortunately, that happened here in Texas, and a lot of people died. But it's going back to the pagan. Like there's some even some indigenous peoples that they're able, like they're quote unquote connected more with nature. And I saw something like was a flood or something came through one island, and there's like the indigenous people there, and everyone died other than the indigenous people because they understood like the weather patterns and all of that deeper than the colonizers. So, but yeah, the forces of nature is very, very prominent in metal. And I would say even philosophy itself, it started out as natural philosophy. You're observing reality in front of you and trying to wrap your mind around it. So, anything to chime on before we wrap up today? Hello.
I like the fact that originally philosophy was part of science. Like you were saying, it's a study of the world, and it's trying to find out how we can be certain of what we think we know. And that's why the Greeks were so momentous in their sense, because they made a systemic outlook that was able to analyze the assumptions that humans live by. And in many ways, we're trying to get back to that because we've gotten very far from it. And someone mentioned here that, the question of whether metal is a Western art form. And of course, that's a very interesting one in itself, because I think just about everyone can enjoy metal on their own terms, but it definitely comes out of the conflict in the West. The 1960s, you had all these hippies coming out telling us that we could have this new age of Aquarius or whatever they were going on about, where everybody lived in utopia and there was love and happiness. And in many ways, that's an extension of the old Christian idea and the one that flourished in America of the city on a hill, where you're beloved by God because you are moral and therefore you will succeed. I think the Puritans were blamed for that one, but it's probably more the tent revivalists that got that one going at first. And coming out of that conflict, where half of humanity wants to, or half of the people in the West, I should say, want to live in this utopian pursuit of equality and love and peace and all things that avoid the conflicts at the core of life. When you have to fight it out, when you have to go hunt the mammoth, and when you have to kill the bad guy. Metal is more in line with the Wild West, your Westerns, your detective stories. I think there's a lot of Chandler in metal, for example, which is that at some point good men have to do really bad things in order to protect others and preserve that fragile sense of social order, which keeps us from dissolving and turning into a failed nation like many of the developed nations out there are. I mean, it's not a nice thing to say about Russia that it's a failed nation, but it's a failed nation. And we're always trying to rediscover what's real, because humans are bullshit engines. Between our emotions, our socialization, our moral judgments, our fears, we just cut huge parts of reality out of our heads. And then when we communicate with others, we spread that disease. And then pretty soon we're all delusional. I mean, if you look at, I was talking earlier with someone about what happened with that brand Jaguar and how they just managed to commit suicide through some kind of marketing venture that was just unwise. It doesn't matter exactly the nature of it being unwise. I didn't bring it up to get into that, and I'm sure that Breitbart will cover that or somebody. But the fact is, it was delusional regarding their audience and why they bought the product. And in a business sense, that's a fatal error. You have to know why people want to buy your cars, and then you have to deliver that to them, or they're going to stop buying your cars. But I think the point of what happened there is you had a committee sitting somewhere, and they talked it to death and got to the point where they were just unwilling to face certain realities. And so they looked at what was left, and they found something that seemed utopian. It was like, yeah, we're gonna be the age of Aquarius car where everyone's happy, and we're gonna make everyone happy. And it's like, well, that's nice. That's nice, you guys. But really, what people want out of Jaguar is something like the name. They want a Predator car. They want something that's fast, a little bit scary, and imposing. And if you deviate from that, you're going to end up losing your audience. I always talk about the new Coke fiasco because it was one of the greatest fiascos in business, where the people behind Coca-Cola decided that since Pepsi had some of the market share, they should make Coke like Pepsi. They forgot the fact that people who were buying Coke were buying it because they liked it as it was. And if they wanted Pepsi, they were buying Pepsi. And so these are very similar. But I think that, committees are self-deluding, human social groups are self-deluding, and we're always struggling to avoid deluding ourselves. A number of thinkers, including Jung, have said that the real conflict in the human mind is not the battle between good and evil, but the battle between order and incoherence. And we are always struggling against the distracting tendencies of all the things around us, and even more, the distracting tendencies of our reaction to things. Jason, you brought up the floods, and I am deliberately avoiding news about that because it's lugubrious. There is nothing good to be had there, and other than going there to help things myself, I have no involvement with it. I can't do anything. And in fact, they've got too many people there, so there's no point going. You just watch it happen. And, we have to internalize events like that where our brains are just screaming at the horror of it all. And yet we have to remind ourselves, as you said, this is the nature of nature. It's not designed in nice, even squares laid out on a grid. It's these chaotic processes that have lots of inputs that we don't necessarily understand. In fact, certainly our weather predicting is missing inputs somewhere in its modeling. And it's doing what it's doing for its own sake, not for our sake. And that gets back to sort of the fundamental thing that I think is bedeviling humanity, which is our natural solipsism, which comes to some degree from our intelligence and to some degree from our fear, which is that we're always thinking that we are the center of the universe and that things that happen in nature have some significance relative to us, instead of recognizing that nature is a system that maintains itself and we live on top of it. And our survival is kind of incidental to it. Perhaps there's an argument that nature produced humanity or produced intelligence for a reason. And I subscribe to this. I think that there is an evolutionary purpose and perhaps a metaphysical purpose to intelligence. But the thing that humans have to accept is that there really isn't this moral order out there where only the bad kids get drowned. There's, as Paul said, an anti-moral order, or as I would say, an amoral order, where the storm does what the storm must. And if kids drown, the storm doesn't notice. It doesn't care. It can't care. And so in many ways, nature is the focus of metal. We are reconnecting to all of the things that have alienated us from nature, like our fears about it. And that's why it's where pop is a ritual of centering people in a social group, metal is a ritual of centering people in a world that isn't necessarily dedicated to us. It's cause-effect, but we are not always the cause or the intended effect of what it's doing. And to accept that is to accept how small we are, how mortal we are, how powerless we are. And that's never going to be popular. That's not a product that Jaguar could sell, and it's not a product Bud Light could sell, and it's not a product Coke could sell, but it's a truth of reality. And so I think it's, metal is in many ways the kids smoking cigarettes out behind the cafeteria. We've dropped out of the social group, and now we're trying to find out what's real. And that's why I think a lot of us enjoy it, because there's this sense of adventure and of escape in getting outside what everyone's insisting is true to figure out what actually is real, so that we can find what is of meaning in our lives with that knowledge. That's all I had to chip in there.
Yeah, great points. Just real quick, and then we'll get to you, Paul. I apologize for stepping in, but just what you're kind of saying about nature and all that, that perhaps intelligence is there for a reason. For Schelling and his philosophy of nature, art is the highest expression of nature. This nature itself is culminating to art. And granted, I'm still a little weak in the Schelling. I'm going to be reading a lot more of them next semester, but I just want to throw that tidbit out there that for the philosopher Schelling, art is the highest expression of nature, and that's very fucking metal, I think. So go ahead, Paul.
So it's interesting that Brett brought up Coke versus Pepsi, because that's a very, very fitting example. I don't know if y'all remember 25 years ago, there was this thing called the Pepsi Challenge, where Pepsi would go around to various places and they'd pour people 1 ounce of Pepsi, 1 ounce of Coke in a blind taste test. And around 80% of people would pick Pepsi. Now, here's the catch, though. It is true that in a 1 ounce sample, most people will favor Pepsi over Coke. And the reason for this is because Pepsi is a lot sweeter than Coke. Pepsi is sweet, 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 whereas Coke has a lot of sweetness, but it balances that against a lot of citrus sourness. And when you take if you drink a larger glass of each, people's preferences usually flip. That sweetness that people enjoy in Pepsi gets very, very cloying when you try to drink a full glass of it. Whereas if you drink a full glass of Coke, that, citric bitterness is needed to cut some of the sweetness. And that's actually a very good metaphor for metal and where we have been going with this whole discussion. Pepsi is effectively the pop music. It's sweet, 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 and you try to drink more than 1 ounce of it, or you listen to more than one song of it, and it's just cloying nothingness. Whereas metal has the sour bitterness to it that ultimately you need in a larger quantity. Now, humans, of course, our ability to sense the larger reality, anything more than the 1 ounce, we only have access to the 5 senses. Our view to reality is blocked by the veil of Maya. So in a sense, in this way, we're kind of stuck with the 1 ounce sample. But the Coke versus Pepsi is a really, really good metaphor, actually, for reality in this context.
Yeah, I think a very interesting example. One of the things that originally drew me to metal when I was, a teenager, was that when I heard it for the first time as a kid, I was terrified by the sound of it. I grew up in the 90s and was surrounded with the common sweetness of pop music and the sort of semi-edgy grunge rock sort of flavors, which didn't really go too much against that sort of easily digestible sound. But when I heard metal, I thought that, well, this is horrible. I'll never want to listen to this again. I was scared by it. But as I grew older, there was something about this initial feeling of being terrified by a certain sort of aura of sound, which drew me back towards it. And I think retrospectively, because this didn't really happen at an intellectual level, it was more of an intuitive thing. It spoke to me about something more deeper going on beneath the sort of sugary veil of common pop culture. And in turns, the more I delved into it, I found out that I was actually being rewarded. The more I listened to it and paid close attention to it, it rewarded me in ways that the normal music that they played on the radio, it never could have.
That's a really good point. I think most people are scared at first by what metal is, because when you're younger, you really don't want to go near things that are scary, like loud machine sounds. And metal has always sounded like an air conditioner with a loose belt or something to me. But, I think that it takes a while to get into it and to experience it. It's really interesting for me because I think it's hard to reconstruct, because this was a long time ago. But my introduction to metal was actually probably not through metal itself, but through people humming the tunes, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, stuff like that they'd heard on the radio. And there are members of my family who were covert metalheads and never would admit to it at family gatherings, which is kind of funny. But, when people hum those melodies and the songs and you start to see how the parts get together, that's a wonderful antidote to the kind of crap that you'd hear at school, where you sing the silly little songs about, safety stuff and, not necessarily the duck and cover song, though I'm sure that happened to some people, the song they made the kids sing about what happens when there's a nuclear war, get under your desk because that'll do something, right? but it's interesting to overcome that initial fear. And I think so many things, you mentioned that Burzum album, and I'm not going to try to match your pronunciation of the title, which was excellent. But the first time I heard it, I hated it. I was like, oh my God, this is just noise, blah, blah, blah. Set it aside, listen to Morbid Angel instead. But over time, it became really a favorite because, when you're out of anything else to listen to, you throw on the Junk album that, you're like, yeah, I'm probably going to sell this one, going to pitch it out, might throw it out of the car window on the way home, blah, blah. And eventually your brain absorbs the patterns and you start to figure out its vocabulary, its language, its internal structure. And then you're able to get beyond just reacting to that pure aesthetic and emotional response. And you start thinking like, wow, there's something going on here. I wonder what the hell's going on here. And it's different. So it takes mental effort and it takes changing your thinking, which people hate to do. But in the end, you have this adventure with an album. And I think there's a lot of albums I've had that I've ended up really loving that at first I just couldn't make heads or tails of. But that in itself was enigmatic. You're like, this thing has me by the tail. I can't figure it out. So I'm going to keep listening to it. And that's really one of the fun things about metal is that a lot of these great albums that, now are so well known, they're just comforts in some ways. You kind of have to figure them out, and you go on an adventure with them. And that's really just a wonderful thing. And, that even extended to some pop stuff. I mean, I would say that the one Led Zeppelin album I'm willing to praise is Physical Graffiti. And I think that has similar aspects, as well as a lot of the great pop albums. I mean, yes, Tales from Topographic Oceans. I really like the Camel Snow Goose, the second album. I think it's the second album. Jesus. Some of those others, some of the early Genesis, all that stuff requires you really it's not an easy listen like pop is. It isn't shaped like the assumptions you already have. It's there to, hit you in the face and rub its balls on your nose and then make you figure it out on your own terms. King Crimson would be another case. I mean, the first time you hear a 21st Century Schizoid Man, you're like, wow, that's one really ugly song. But over time, you just find yourself like, yeah, it's supposed to be an ugly song. It's making something beautiful out of ugliness and the fact that everyone around you is crazy. So there's always that inversion in metal, I think.
Yeah, but I think it also goes back to, one of the central themes in Plato's authorship, the confrontation between Socrates as the philosopher versus the sophists, when on the surface level, they actually sort of sound similar. They are both saying strange complex things that makes you go, what? But the sophists are always only occupied with the stuff that can make them personally gain something, and they can sell the stuff to others, learn how to speak like this, and people will admire you because you will sound very intelligent and blah, 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 blah. Whereas Socrates, as he's just the guy who's hanging around Athens and talking up random people and asking them about stuff. He's not selling anything, and it won't make you popular to go the Socratic route. But in the end, what draws people back to Socrates, as opposed to the sophists, is the fact that the stuff that he's saying is actually unfolding over time, and it blooms into this sort of marvelous intellectual way of looking at reality as something to revere, something to find great mystery in, and last but not least, something which is not subduable to our way of controlling it.
Yeah, the revealing part of the Socratic dialogue is really great with the Plato. Like with the Gorgias, the argument that ultimately dismantled Gorgias was when Socrates said, because Gorgias was arguing that being a public speaker can serve the higher good for the best interests of the people, and that in itself is really commendable. However, Socrates said, but your students, the sophists that you're training, may have immoral intentions. They could end up being like the Biden administration and being very deceptive. But getting into how the revealing throughout the dialogues with the Republic, they talk about justice a lot, but they don't actually get into it until like chapter 4 or book 4. of the Republic. And that's when you get into the tripartite soul and all that, and the different metals, the noble lie and all that. But yeah, it's really I don't know why Nietzsche hated Plato so much, because I feel like perhaps because some people misconstrued Nietzsche's sophist in some regard. Like, I don't know, like Gorgias is also considered like the first nihilist, essentially. But it's kind of interesting that when you get into like someone who's trying to discover truth, ultimately, it may not have like a firm conclusion, but what it does is it tramples the false, essentially. So truth tramples the false, and that's what I get from the dialogues, and I view a lot of it as psychological, like the Republic. A lot of people say that's his politics, but Plato's politics is in the laws, which is a tougher read. It's not as well written and popular as the Republic, but just kind of interesting there. And what you guys were saying a little bit earlier about how some metal albums don't really click because it's not something that you would essentially like. We try to rationalize things and try to, we have our preferences of established forms. And when the first time I heard Samath Godless Arrogance, it was completely different than everything else I had heard. And it took a few listens for it to eventually click. I'm like, now I know why everyone's raving over this. This is unbridled aggression, and it's not here to please you. It's here to confront you, and it's doing so on its own terms. And I love it now. Now I consider it a classic. But when I first heard it, I'm like, this is completely different than everything else that I love. Like, but it took some time for me to grapple it and approach it on its own terms, essentially.
That's a good point. I think that there's an argument that Socrates is one of the first nihilists, and in fact is very metal, in that the Socratic method consists of pulling apart structures to look at the internal correspondences in them, sort of like rift gluing. And he's essentially pulling things toward their very first principles to see what we can actually know that's true. It's possible that Nietzsche criticized Socrates for two reasons. The first would be, as you intuited, to counter-signal the idea that Nietzsche is simply a libertarian. And the second is, I think, that he recognized that Socrates and the death of Socrates is an archetype that was later carried forth in Jesus. And his point was that embracing death is rarely a good thing. I don't think he liked the fact that Socrates allowed himself to be killed by democracy simply to shame democracy. Nietzsche wanted Socrates to pick up a sword and go kill democracy, but that's easier said than done, as we might say. But
didn't Nietzsche say to die at the right time to make your ultimate statement, though? That's what Socrates did. Like, Nietzsche was, too many people live beyond, their usefulness, essentially, for that statement that Nietzsche had. And he was like, you need to die at the right time. And for Socrates, that he died at the right time. He became this huge fucking figure of philosophy.
I agree. I think Nietzsche objected to the passive way that happened, which is that there was a guilt trap. Socrates had the chance to leave. He had the chance to escape the death sentence. Instead, he said, no, I'm an old guy. If you guys want to kill me, go ahead. And I'm just going to reveal who you are by dying. And I think Nietzsche didn't like that, possibly. It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell exactly why he was so angry at Socrates. And it's hard to take it seriously, because a lot of Nietzsche's stuff is merely signaling. He's not telling you exactly what he thinks. He's telling you where to start your thinking. And a lot of people perceive him as contradictory. I do not. I agree with your assessment of how he would have seen, absent the passive nature of it, Socrates' choice of his time of dying, in that he said, well, I can make my death significant this way, and it's going to be the perfect cap to everything I've been saying. I've been telling you that democracy is an issue. Well, democracy is going to kill me now for saying things, and they claim I'm corrupting the minds of the youth, so they think this is a moral thing to kill me. So, well, here's a stain on history, and you're all going to have to face it now. But I think that there's the more interesting thing about Socrates is that, unlike everyone else in the Republic, at least, he's not basing his thought on assertions. He's basing his thought on removing assertions and looking into assertions and saying, well, are you certain that that's the case? Does this actually connect up? And his test is the cause-effect logic, which ultimately is the core of his metaphysics. And so everything ties together in Plato. It's very studied, which I don't think we've seen anything that orderly in philosophy since, which makes it really interesting. But I think there's a metal comparison in that Socrates does not try to assert an order as the basis of his thinking. He sort of asserts an anti-order. He says, most things are wrong. Let's look into them and see what persists. And he gets things down to, he reduces anything he's talking about to a ceremony of opposites, as I call it, where he says, well, there's a cycle here. There's a thing and an anti-thing, but instead of going with the Hegelian idea that somehow that leads to utopia, he goes with the idea that it's cyclic. This is more like what people think of as being Eastern, but in fact is not based in the idea of balance per se. It's based in the idea of continuity, of if you have something bad happen, something good will counter it, and then something bad will happen in response, and that's how events go on. It's I think it was the South Park guys who said every script must be in terms of two things, and then something happened, but something else countered it, and that strikes me as very much like reality. I mean, not in an even sense, like there's a drum beat and good, bad happens like that, but more in a sense that just for events to continue, for time to move forward, in our perception at least, there have to be a change in events. And you wouldn't, if you had constant good, like in the prosperity gospel vision of heaven, you'd be pretty bored, because even the best donut in the world is going to get boring after a while, unless at some point you have to have some castor oil, and then you're like, wow, I really want that donut back. But if you were subjected to 1,000 days of eating the world's most perfect donut, at some point you'd crave the castor oil. And that's inherent to a lot of what Socrates says. He says, we're looking at this consistency to nature, that there's opposites, and together they work to produce this sort of ongoing state in which beauty is possible, and which seems to ultimately tend toward beauty over time. And that's really a powerful statement, because it contradicts the moralism, not just of the sophists, but of the Pharisees and really of the ancient Arabs, where they wanted to process the world into this good and bad and control it on the basis of methods, so that you could remove all the bad and have only the good. And he was very skeptical of that. And I think that's very, very metal.
Yeah, I think it's also very interesting the way that Plato, in the form of Socrates, of course, usually when he starts off by, having this sort of rational inquiry into the nature of our assertions and testing them against each other. But when things get real, so to speak, he often goes into the language of mythology. He starts telling stories, as for example, by the end of the Republic, with the story of and it's almost as if there's a little specific point in this, namely the fact that once we break down our quote unquote stupid assertions about how reality and society and so on naturally functions, you start opening up the mind to intuitions which aren't readily translatable into, sort of rationalistic tales. So you have to get poetic about it. And there's a lot of parallels to Nietzsche in that sense, I think, and it has always been one of the great mysteries to me. Also, why Nietzsche is so ferocious in his attacks on Socrates. I always sort of assumed that it had to do with the destruction of idols. That Socrates represented something in philosophy which you could destroy without thereby destroying the spirit, which carried on the discipline of philosophy as such. But that's speculation. That's a subject for another time.
Also, I think it's in Phaedo where Socrates said he starts questioning his life as a philosopher, and he has a recurring dream that he just should make music. And he was questioning, it's like, I should have been a musician and just make music and all that before he was executed. So he even questions himself. And, he questions his own life and all that. It's very beautiful. And that's one thing that I appreciate about Plato is he comes to very beautiful analogies and all that. So, so we've gone on for an hour and a half. Shall we continue or wrap up?
I have to leave the conversation within maybe 10 minutes or so, but it's been an absolute pleasure.
Yes, Jacob, it's been great to have you on and finally chat with you a little bit. I apologize for being a little hungover today, but you guys have been very graceful and very wonderful discussion that we've had. Everyone's been very insightful. So yeah, let's go ahead and wrap up. Jacob, thank you very much again for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And Sodomizer, Brett Stevens, the guy who can analyze things to the nitty-gritty, get to the kernel, the essence. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to our other guests too, Paul and Jacob. You have really contributed a great deal to this discussion, as have you, Jason. This has been a pleasure.
And Paul, he's the guy who likes the Coca-Cola. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. Thank you for listening. Cheers.